Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Physical Disability Australia's webinar, NDIS in Review, a conversation with Dougie Herd. My name is Andrew Fairbairn. I'm the President and WA State Director of Physical Disability Australia, and it's wonderful to have you with us for this informative and important event. I'd like to begin on behalf of PDA by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we dwell and pay our respects to elders past and present. I reside on Wajak Noongar Budja, 12 kilometres north of the city of Perth. PDA also acknowledges people with disability, past and present, and those who are living full and complete lives, and those who have needs that are not yet being met. We ask you to reflect on this and to work with us to bring about the changes that give all people with disability an opportunity to live an ordinary life. PDA welcomes you to today's webinar. We are sure that you will find it beneficial and very helpful. For your information, we will be recording this webinar for use on PDA's social media channels. Please let us know in the chat or to reach out to Natasha, the PDA's Comms and Engagement Manager, if you have any concerns about that or would like to be kept anonymous at any stage. Everyone has been muted, and that we'd appreciate everyone remaining so until after Dougie's initial presentation, and only unmuting in the second part of the evening when Dougie opens up the conversation to the floor and to individuals, and those individuals who raise their hands and are directed by me to ask their question, then they can unmute themselves. This I find interesting, a little bit demographic for tonight. This is something we haven't really tracked before, but this is interesting. So in terms of registrants who are online tonight, we've had 29 people who are NDIS participants. 2 are parents of NDIS participants. 1 is a carer of an NDIS participant. 3 are service providers. 3 work in the advocacy space with a disabled persons organisation, and 6 are people with disabilities who are not NDIS participants. So we have a very broad cross-section of the disability community here to hear Dougie. So that being said, would like to introduce Dougie to you all. Dougie is a well-known and very highly respected disability advocate who has worked in the disability space for over 39 years. His experience and recognised expertise has seen him involved in many notable roles, and I have a list of about 30 of them. If you'd like that list, I'd be happy to send it to you later on. And because I want to hear from him, I'm going to jump down a couple of pages of his bio. Dougie is an NDIS participant himself, and he has had a twofold perspective and understanding of the NDIS, its goals, capabilities, successes, failings, and where it needs to go from here to truly achieve its mission. Dougie has been a quadriplegic wheelchair user for 36 years. He recently completed an honours degree in English literature at the Australian National University. He's an accomplished writer and a dedicated and proud supporter of Partick Thistle Football Club, the third and least famous football team in Glasgow, Scotland. So Dougie, I'm going to hand it over to you, and we look forward to hearing your wisdom. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Dougie Herd. As you can probably see from my background, I'm here in Canberra on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I wish to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and the emerging leaders. What the bio tells you is I'm a daggy old man. I've been around forever, and I see that my good friend and former chair of a board to which I used to report, Andrew Buchanan, is online. Disability Council of New South Wales. We worked together for 6 years. And as Andrew knows, I talk too much. So I'm going to try and whiz through some topics that I was suggested as quickly as possible so that we can leave as much time together for you to comment, ask questions about the really important point of what brings us together, I feel, which is the review that's currently underway into the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So I was asked if I could just say a few words about how we got the NDIS, where it came from in a sense, where we are now, what caused the review to be necessary and set up, and what the review is attempting to do and hope for the future. So let me run through those topics as quickly as I possibly can. And it's somewhat simple, I think, in a sense. Many of us know that disability supports and services were poorly organised and underfunded, have been for a long time. And when Prime Minister Rudd was first Prime Minister 2007, he set up a forum called the Australia 2020. And what do we look forward to? What do we want for the future? And one of the ideas that came out of that Australia 2020 forum was to set up a coherent, good, unified, consistent disability support system for people with disability here in Australia. And the reason that was the case is because things weren't right for people. Services were thin, people weren't getting access to supports, and many people struggled, families found it difficult. The Rudd government set up their parliamentary secretary at the time, Bill Shorten, asked the Productivity Commission to have a look at the setup of disability supports and how they could be improved. Andrew and I worked on a submission from the Disability Council of New South Wales, hundreds of other organisations, advocates, providers, families, people with disability, governments themselves put submissions in. And after, I think, about a year, the Productivity Commission produced the report. And the one thing I remember still from that report, which was 2 volumes long, over 1,000 pages, was the brief observation that these economists made, which said that Australia's diverse disability service systems run by governments in all parts of Australia were underfunded, unfair, fragmented, and inefficient, and that people who needed the supports weren't getting them, and that there therefore should be, the governments said, something called a National Disability Insurance Scheme created so that wherever a person with a disability had what we now talk about as a reasonable and necessary support need that needed to be funded through an individual package, in addition to whatever was being provided by states and territories in what we call the mainstream, that service would be there, people would get it, it would be fair and equitable, it would be sufficient for their needs, and it would be consistent across the whole country. And that was the idea. In 2013, 10 years ago, that idea came to fruition when the National Disability Insurance Scheme was launched from Newcastle on the 1st of July, 2013. I was fortunate enough to be there as part of the launch, because by that time, I was also fortunate enough to work for the National Disability Insurance Agency. I had been working in Sydney. Person I knew who was the Chief Executive Officer of the Motor Accidents Authority in Sydney and had worked with the Lifetime Care and Support Authority, which was a kind of early indication of how some of this personal budgets, rights and choice and control could work for people in New South Wales. Offered me a job with the National Disability Insurance Agency to help launch it. And I said yes, before I knew that the job was in Canberra. And so that's how I ended up here. I migrated from Scotland to live near a beach in Sydney in the warmth. And for the last 10 years, I've been freezing my butt off in Canberra every winter, about 1 million miles away from the nearest beach you can imagine. But to be frank, at that time, and still today, I would have gone anywhere in the country to help launch the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Roll fast forward on to now, and here we are, 10 years later. The National Disability Insurance Scheme has rolled out. There are 610,000 people with an NDIS plan living in every part of the country. There are 140,000 providers of supports who receive some income through the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and most of those providers are sole traders or small partnerships, maybe people working on their own, like therapists or individual support workers, who have taken the opportunity of the expanded market that the NDIS has created. And the governments of Australia, having pulled the resources into the National Disability Insurance Scheme, we find ourselves here in 2023 with $35 billion being invested in the plans of people who have an NDIS package. But what's become apparent across those 10 years is that the National Disability Insurance Scheme is not working as was intended. And I think that's for a couple of reasons in the main. Partly because what 10 years of development has told us, going from no participants to over 600,000 participants, is that some of what we used to call unmet need for supports has emerged and come out and come into the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and that we therefore find a different pattern of people who want and need NDIS supports than we anticipated when the Productivity Commission first wrote the report. The other thing that's happened is that, and I'm not a member of any political party, so I'm not making a party political point here. It's unambiguously true and obvious to anyone who looks at the history of the NDIS that for most of the last 10 years, the previous government of Australia was negligent in its approach to leadership when it came to the NDIS. 18 months into the formation of the NDIS, they put a limit on the number of people who could work for the NDIA. To plug the gap that they therefore created themselves, they took people who were organizations known as local area coordinators, who were supposed to be helping participants to make connections in their local communities, to get on with living their lives to the best of their abilities, exercising choice and control over their supports, to live an ordinary, a good life, whatever we call it, in their communities, with their families, to get on with life. And instead of those local area coordinators doing that work, they ended up being kind of pre-planners inside the NDIS, which meant that what happened over time is that fewer and fewer of the people with disability who were in the NDIS were ever connected to the people called planners who inside the National Disability Agency made decisions about our lives. I'm an NDIS participant. I've had a plan for 4 years. I've only once in those 4 years met in person the human being that took decisions about my life, gave me a plan, a so-called plan, because they're not plans, they're budget allocations. And then sometimes later, some anonymous computer somewhere sent me what is called a plan letter that told me how much money I was getting, what areas I could spend it in. And none of that had been decided with me in the room, me contributing to the discussion about how that money ought to be allocated and used. Apart from that first time when I met somebody who didn't even work for the NDIA, I was, the only other times I've spoken to anybody about my plan is once a year when somebody phoned me up. They had no idea who I was. I had no idea where they were working from. They didn't tell me. And then they essentially said, well, how's your plan going? I said, my plan's going all right. And said, well, that's fine. That's our annual review over. That was never what this was supposed to be about. And when the new government came in, 18 months ago or so, whenever it was, 2022, by that time, Minister for the NDIS, Bill Shorten, having listened to what people with disability said, what the Every Australian Count said, campaign said about the failures of the last 10 years, Minister Shorten created this NDIS review, an independent review, Its panel, of which I'm a member, there are 7 of us. Professor Bruce Bonahady and Lisa Paul are the co-chairs, and there are 5 others of us. And if you want to know who we are and what we do, you can go to the website and have a look at ndisreview.gov.au, where there's much more information. Our review was established on the 18th of October, the same day that Kurt Fernley became the new chair of the NDIA board, which is fantastic. And the other board members were appointed on that same day, meaning that the board, for the first time in its history, has at least half of its members are people with disability themselves, and that's a significant change. And the new chief executive of the NDIS, Rebecca Falkingham, came into her job. So a new team at the NDIA, a new idea about the NDIS, and an independent review that would conduct an investigation of how we can get the NDIS back on track is what we've said. We've had hundreds of meetings with people. We've received over 2,500 submissions so far. We've extended the submission deadline by a week to the 1st of September if anybody wants to add a brief comment on how the NDIS should change, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. We've spoken with thousands of people. The review panel has traveled all over the country. I'm here tonight with you, and it's a real pleasure. Last night, Professor Bonahady and Lisa Paul were at a community panel up in Darwin, because tomorrow they're having a day-long discussion with the Disability Ministers' Council, talking about the NDIS review. And what we've been asking and what we've been told are pretty clear at this point. Question is, how do we make the NDIS better 10 years in, basically? Because we know its got problems, but we also know, and this is an absolute truth, that the NDIS has been transformational in people's lives. Hundreds of thousands of people, literally hundreds of thousands of people, live better lives as a consequence of this thing called the NDIS. But it's not all it could or should be. So how do we make it better? And in the responses that we've heard, some themes have emerged. And I'll just take a few minutes and then finish on this and open up. We published about 5 weeks ago a report which we've called What We Have Heard, because we're imaginative in our titles, in our documents. It's exactly what people have told us, all those thousands of people who've given us feedback, all kinds of people, participants, family members, providers, disability advocacy organisations, allied health professionals, governments of Australia, everyone you could think of who's part of this big stakeholder mix that sits behind the words National Disability Insurance Scheme. Some things they told us were very clear, and I'll just summarise them very quickly because I think they're probably apparent to all of them. How we've described them in these 5 big key areas goes this way. Probably a phrase we've all heard.
Listen if you like.
Probably a phrase we've heard somebody say, Al Shorten, Bonahady, lots of others. First big problem. Why is the NDIS an oasis in the desert? Other words we've used are oasis in the desert, lifeboat in the ocean, the only island in the sea. It's become clear that in the 10 years that the NDIS has been bringing in and supporting more and more people through individualized packages, what people told us is that what we call mainstream supports funded through our states and territory governments in education, health, housing, transport, and all those kinds of areas have become less inclusive at times for many people with disability than they were 10 years ago. And that has created real difficulties, real pressure, which leads people to think that the only way that they can get support is to find their way into the NDIS, to get an individualized package, to make sure the package is big enough. And that has caused governments, communities, mainstream universal services and supports to somewhat retreat from the world of supporting people with disability. And we need to fix that problem because that is completely wrong. We have rights under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. We should be able to go through life as citizens of Australia, getting the support that we need from housing, transport, health, employment, all the other services, being able to go to the shops, to the restaurants, to the theatre, to whatever it is we want to do in our lives. But this tendency towards, oh, if it's disability, throw it into the NDIS is something that has occurred and we need to change. 2, what does reasonable and necessary mean? Nobody's really clear. That's a fundamental idea of the NDIS Act, that people should get supports that are related to their disability, their disabling condition, and that those supports should be funded in a reasonable and necessary way. And people tell us that they're not sure what that means. And when they get into an NDIS planning meeting, it becomes confusing, difficult, sometimes stressful. Some folk have told us, quite a few folk actually, parents and people with disability have told us that they have found the planning processes of the National Disability Insurance Scheme traumatic, stressful, difficult, confusing, and they want that to change. And we're trying to find ways to suggest how that might be. Why are there so many children or more children? Not so many children, that sounds like there's a problem having children in the scheme, which it's not. Why are there many more children in the NDIS than we all expected? Again, I think there are 2 reasons. I think part of the reason is that the Productivity Commission, like the rest of Australian society, did not understand how widespread the need for support amongst children who have a disability, a developmental delay, a learning disability, a learning difficulty was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And as the NDIS has progressed, that has become more apparent. But the other side of that coin is that it's become absolutely clear that particularly education, health, childcare have adopted a kind of exclusionary stance, is how I would describe it. That, oh, if you're a child with an autistic condition, if you're an autistic person, you need to go to the NDIS for support. And we believe, because autistic people, parents of autistic children tell us, they want support for their children in their children's community so they can grow, thrive, develop, and become adults who contribute as much to society as anyone else does. But that the environment in which those children grow up is not welcoming, doesn't meet their needs, has no support. And so they, again, feel drawn to the NDIS when that might not be the first or necessary place for them to be. Although for many children with disability, the NDIS is of course the right place to be. 4th thing, I'm nearly done. Why aren't the NDIS markets working? People find it very difficult to make a sense of how the provider side of things operates, even though there are some fantastic, many fantastic, really deeply committed providers. I work for an NDIS provider. I think we're fantastic. I believe we do a really good job. I also work in a place, Canberra, big city, in Australian terms, but not as big as Sydney or Melbourne, obviously, in which even here in the nation's capital, there are what we call thin markets, where it's impossible to have real choice and control because there isn't at times a thriving, vibrant market. And imagine how much more difficult that is for First Nations people living in very remote communities in the Northern Territory, the Barkly region, for instance, where the NDIS had one of its early trial sites, or lots of other parts of Australia, or in areas where there are pockets of populations of people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds for whom the way in which the markets operate doesn't work for them. And we need to get an answer to that question. And part of the answer could be that not everything that gets provided in the way of supports can be, should be, or needs to be driven by a market-based fee for service after the point of delivery approach. We're never going to, nobody wants to get rid of individualized packages, but sometimes some different ways of commissioning supports might be a better way to make sure what we call thin markets can provide supports to people who need them. And the last thing is, how do we make the NDIS sustainable? When the NDIS was launched, the projection was it was going to cost $22 billion and support 411,000 people. This year, we will support somewhere in the region of 650,000 people, and it will cost $35 billion. We want to make it clear to everybody through this review that what we mean by sustainability is not what the editorial writing team of the Australian Financial Review means. How much does it cost? And if it costs this much money, that's whatever the number is, that's too much. Sustainability has two parts. The NDIS costs money. And I believe, as a taxpayer, that we all want to make sure that we get the best value for the money that we invest through our taxes in the NDIS, and that the bulk of that money, when it's invested in people's lives, goes to the supports that people need to live their lives. Of course we do. The NDIS costs some money, and we want to make sure that it's right. The other side of it, though, critically important, is that the NDIS is an investment in people's lives, in people's families, communities, and the Australian economy. We don't just measure cost benefit in numbers and finance, but when we do make that judgment, it's unambiguously true that for every dollar that the NDIS costs, it brings back to the Australian economy $2.15. It's good for the economy, it's good for people, and it helps people thrive. So, talked much too long. I'm very, very sorry. But that's about all I think I can say, and hope that it's encouraged you to ask some questions about how we carry on this reform. I'll try to answer as many as I can. If we don't get through them all, I'll ask PDA to send us the questions, and we'll try to get answers to you either individually or as themed. So sorry for talking too much. I hope that's at least been helpful.
Absolutely 100% helpful. Thank you, Dougie. I could sit here and listen to you all night. Seriously, the wealth of your knowledge and your understanding of this and how it all works is really, really valuable. Thank you for that. So we'll launch into the questions. We'll get rapid fire going. But before we do that, I just want to remind everybody, Dougie's happy to answer questions regarding NDIS policy, but he's not able to answer any questions around operations of the NDIA / NDIS, or to give advice of individual cases. So we just want to keep that in mind as we roll through this. So I have, to start with, I've got a question from Kylie. Her question, Dougie, is how quickly will the recommendations from the NDIS review be enacted?
We have to give our report to the governments of Australia. Important to say that it's all the governments. The terms of reference we were given come not just from the Commonwealth Government, but from states and territory governments as well. And that's important for each of you, because you might want to tell your local government disability minister or state government minister what you think about the recommendations, because they will help determine them. I understand, although I've not been told this personally, but believe that National Cabinet is due to meet in November and will receive the report. It won't be published as soon as we give it to the government. National Cabinet will give consideration to the report that we submit. I hope the report will be published as soon as possible thereafter. I'd like it to be published before Christmas. And then the critical point starts, which is a not very precise but necessary answer to Kylie's question. governments will decide which of the recommendations, and we've not written our recommendations yet, which of our recommendations will be accepted by the governments and are to be implemented. Amongst our recommendations, when we do get round to them, will be that we think there should be somebody given the job of overseeing the implementation of those recommendations, that the government should give to people a clear timetable about when particular recommendations will start, be introduced, and that some of the recommendations, when they're accepted, involve quite fundamental change to the relationship between the NDIS to what we call mainstream supports and what we're calling foundational supports that require states and territories to make changes. And so we will not be suggesting that those things can be changed overnight, and that there therefore needs to be a clear transition path set out by governments making changes so that we all understand how these changes will come about, when they will be introduced, and what the consequences of the changes will be. And the critical thing sitting alongside that timetable, which we want governments to give, has to be an unambiguous commitment from all the governments recommending changes, that people with disability, their representative organisations, disabled advocacy organisations, peer support bodies will be involved in designing, testing, and helping to introduce these changes. Because if we don't make these changes together with people with disability at the centre of telling governments what these changes mean for them and how X, Y, or Z reform will work, they will not bed down into a better NDIS for the future. So there isn't a D-Day date, there isn't a big switch off the old system, switch on the new system. There will be a gradual introduction over time of recommendations that people with disability and their organisations have played a fundamental part in shaping. That's our intention, but it's up to the governments of Australia to decide what, when, and how they will do some of the things I hope they will accept.
Thank you, Dougie. That's brilliant. Kylie's just put a comment in the chat. She really appreciates answering her question, as it's an important time in disability. So thank you for positing that question. Kylie, I'm going to throw into Canberra. Talia, you're up. You've got a question? Go for it.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Dougie. Really appreciate the conversation tonight. I guess I have a quick question in the fact that we know that the participant levels are growing tremendously within the child area. My question is, would it ever be a consideration, or is it something that I would have to submit for the review, to actually separate and have a child NDIS and adult NDIS, only in the fact that, I mean, all disability individuals deserve the same rights and access and so forth, but to actually find specific people or communities within those groups that can help provide that community access. I know that especially with adults, we don't have that one, a lot of us don't have the individual that's going to promote what community options are available for us. But if there was dedicated people within this specialisation, would it ever be a consideration?
I wouldn't quite describe it in the way in which you described it, but that's just sentence construction. Don't worry about that. What we've been told by parents of young children with disability, organisations like Children and Young People with Disability Australia, academic experts, allied health experts, advocacy organisations, is that there needs to be a somewhat different approach to children, because use this as a silly point of comparison. When I went down to the beach in Scotland and dived in and broke my neck in 3 places, that was it. You know, you don't get it back. You don't get going to hospital and 5 minutes later tap dance out because they fixed you. But it's a stable, ongoing condition. But for children, for some children, this is not true, but for some children, particularly kids with an autistic condition, autistic kids. The early intervention, very early intervention from the right kinds of mainstream, foundational, and if necessary, individualized funded supports makes a profound difference to their life story. And the important thing, I think, is the important difference that can be made is that those parents with well-informed and supported families, in wherever those families live their lives, early childhood intervention, mother and family centres, in school that's inclusive and welcoming, will be able to grow and develop as autistic human beings, not second best, just autistic human beings whose lives work somewhat differently from this old Scottish guy's. And that what we need to do is make sure that the NDIS and the other agencies and services around work together where that is necessary to give all of those kids the best life start that they possibly can get. Some of them may grow up and continue to be in the NDIS for the rest of their lives, but that's the promise the NDIS gave to the Australian people. If you need a lifetime support, it will be there. Other kids will grow up to maybe not need an NDIS support. And so this is not all about, I did an interview and I was asked to go and do an interview as part of video, somebody out in Queensland, some shop job. And he said, well, of course, we all understand why people like you are on the NDIS, but surely all these kids don't need to be on the NDIS. And I kind of felt, well, there's a hierarchy of value. So what we need is to make sure that however and wherever a human being is supported by a disability support, the mix of opportunities for that support is the right mix. And for many, it will be an NDIS package, including some children. And for others, it will be getting support where and when they need it. It's not an individual package funded through the NDIS, but is funded through or is supported, funded, perhaps in a different way, through supports that every person with a disability can have access to. And that's why we want to call them foundational supports, because it's upon foundations that you build better outcomes, is what I think.
I'd agree, 100%. Thank you. Okay, we got a question from Deborah, whose adult son is an NDIS participant. And she asked the question, says, acceptance has been stymied by mostly ineffectual disability employment services. What systemic reforms are planned?
Well, there's a whole lot of reforms being considered by the governments elsewhere. We're not looking directly at things like the disability employment services and ADEs, if that's what they're called, adult disability enterprises. That sits alongside some of what we're doing. It began before our review came along. One of the things we will say, and it's in a somewhat generalized sense, so forgive me that it's not super detailed, is that like housing, for instance, in our societies, access to employment is considered the usual route for all of us as we leave school, transition into adulthood, and join a community. And that people with disability, NDIS supported or through some other bit of government, should have the opportunity to realise that so-called normal path into adulthood and life. And what's absolutely clear is that that goal has not yet been achieved. And so one of the things that we've discussed, it was mentioned by Bruce Bonihady in his speech on Tuesday in Newcastle, is a suggestion that, well, because we've got a thing called the Australian Disability Strategy, which is very good and valuable, but it doesn't have much teeth behind it, doesn't have a lot of dollars. And so it's not as effective as any of us would want it to be.
Yeah.
So one of the things we'd suggest is that the governments of Australia should agree. I think they call them intergovernmental agreements. That the NDIS is part of this ecosystem, and that sufficient government weight should be given to reform through intergovernmental agreements and housing, transport, employment, whatever it might be, to push forward all communities, all government services, all forms of support, and to shift attitudes amongst the community as a whole around things like, well, can a guy who's paralyzed from the neck down, sitting in a wheelchair, actually be chief executive of a $20 million organization in the capital of Australia? The answer is yes, of course I can. But not everybody gets that respect. And so we need to do more. I'm afraid that's not a very adequate answer. I'm sure from your point of view, Deborah, I'm sorry that it feels so kind of on the one hand and the other hand. But we need to make sure that the right environment is created to change government action in ways that people who want employment can get the support they need when they need it. I think in a way that is better than it's been given now.
Yep, thank you. No, that's a good answer. It's a bit of a minefield out there, that for sure. Okay, I have another question for you, Dougie. This is Kylie, and this is a different Kylie, a nominee to 2 NDIS participants. She would like to know, will there be a reduction in the need to go to the AAT?
Oh. There better be. I mean, forgive me, there has been since, and again, make it absolutely clear, I am not a member of any political party, so I'm not doing a political advert in public, party political broadcast for anybody here. Since the new government came in, one of the first acts that Minister Shorten took was to set up a panel. It was led by Graham Innes, the former Disability Discrimination Commissioner, who's a lawyer, so I mean, he knows about these things. It had other lawyers, and its stated goal at that time when it was created, there were 4,000 cases, that's people, human beings, waiting in a queue to join the Administrative Appeal Tribunal hearing system so that they could get their complaint against the National Disability Insurance Agency sorted. Last week, I think it was, Minister Shorten said that 85% of those cases in the queue have been resolved through the kind of mediation process that he established, and so that waiting list has gone down, and that is only to be congratulated for that. Here's what made me roll my eyes when I was asked the question. I believe, and I think this is as near criminal as anything gets. It's my belief that the previous leadership of the National Disability Agency 2, 3, 4 years ago abused the Administrative Appeals Tribunal process. They weaponized it against participants who wanted to complain or review decisions that they didn't agree with. And rather than resolve the cases internally, they deliberately kicked them upstairs to the AAT to discourage people from making complaints, to make it difficult and lengthy to resolve those complaints. And we know this because I remember, I think it was about 2.5 years ago, the then Chief Executive Officer of the NDIA sat in a Senate hearing, a budget estimates or Senate hearings committee, I can't remember what they're called, and said to the senators who asked the question was, how much money so far this financial year have you spent on lawyers for the AAT? And the answer was 25 million, which meant that the projection for the whole year that year was that the National Disability Insurance Agency would spend $50 million to fund lawyers to go to court, the tribunal, to browbeat, I think, participants into submitting to decisions. And what the evidence tells us about that process is that the vast overwhelming majority of cases that are taken to the AAT were resolved before the hearing came about and were resolved in favour of the participants' initial complaint. I think it was a shocking way for a public service to behave to participants, to citizens. And I'm glad, therefore, that the government of Australia, one of its recent announcements was that they are going to abolish the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and replace it with a more responsive tribunal system, but one that is not set up to bully people into submission.
Yep. Yeah, cool. Thank you. So next question that has come through to us is from Crystal. Crystal's an NDIS participant. She would like to know, how can people with disabilities start working with the NDIA and other businesses to bring their skill sets and lived experience?
Well, I mean, one is keep an eye out for adverts from the National Disability Insurance Agency on their website. I think you can sign up to their, they are a big employer. You can, I mean, I once worked for them for 20 months. In terms of a couple of things to say as an observation, it's deeply regrettable that now the Commonwealth Public Service employs a lower proportion of people with disability than it did 15 or 20 years ago. I think that's also true in many state and territory government departments, and government is a big employer. And in my town, that's, you know, it's a one agency, it's a one industry town, and that industry is two industries, universities and public servants. There's a lower proportion of people with disability employed than there used to be. But within that concern more generally, I think it's true that the National Disability Insurance Agency is one of the best performing public service agencies for employing people with disability, family members and others connected to people with disability. And in that regard, they should receive some congratulations for being one of the best employers. But there's a bit of me that also thinks, well, you know, if the National Disability Insurance Agency can't be one of the best employers of people with disability in the public service, who should be? But I believe that their commitment to involve people with disability in their workforce is a genuine and real one. I always think that organisations can do better to employ more people from disadvantaged, discriminated against groups. I believe that a diverse workforce is a good and better workforce because it connects with the people in a diverse way whose services they rely upon. And so hook up to the NDIA's recruitment newsletter thing or notification system, and then apply for any job you think you're the right person for. Good luck, and I hope you get a job, because it's good fun working for the NDIA when they do a good job.
Thank you, Dougie. That's excellent. Anna has asked, and Anna is an NDIS participant, and she has asked, under Labor, are there any positive changes or is it only gaslighting?
I've no idea, Anna. You know what? I say again, I am not a member of any political party. I think any reasonable person who looks at the history of the NDIS will see there was bipartisan support. Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott, you couldn't get two politicians further apart, who perhaps disliked one another more than any politicians I've ever encountered in my life. But nevertheless, it was around the creation and establishment of the NDIS that they came together. I think it's unambiguously true that after there was an election and a change of government in 2013, it's not a party political point, demonstrably evident that the decisions were taken by the government of the day that made the job more difficult for the NDIS to thrive and survive, and that we're reaping some of the consequences of what I believe was 8 years bad management by a government that seemed not to really understand what the NDIS was about and seemed not to want to make it succeed, and has created problems such as the becoming the ocean, the only lifeboat in the ocean, by not allowing local area coordinators to do the job they were supposed to do because they'd reduced the number of people who are working for the agency. I believe that's true. And I believe that in the last 18 months, there have been changes made to the whole environment, to the relationships between the NDIA, the NDIS, and participants, and between governments that show real progress and change. But as in all of these things, what really matters is your next result. What will happen next? Will you honour governments in Australia, whatever political party you may be, the commitments that you've given to make the NDIS better? And the people of Australia, participants, non-participants, family members, will judge their actions over the next 2 to 3 years. I believe, personal opinion, it's not a panel opinion, I believe the governments of Australia have a once-in-a-generational opportunity to fix the NDIS, because we've seen what can happen to it in the last 10 years. And if they really are committed to giving people with disability and their families a better future, then they need to listen to what we have said as people with disability and families over the last 10 years. Listen to what our advocacy organisations say about a better future. And then they need to make decisions that will give us all the chance that anyone in Australia wants for a better future. And I think they will succeed or fail, not because they're Labour or Green or Coalition or whatever it might be. It'll be because if they listen to what people say, they will probably get a good result. Because I think, by and large, when people do like we did in 2011, 2012, get together and say, this thing we want to call the National Disability Insurance Scheme is a good idea. When governments listen to their peoples, they by and large get things right, is what I think. But that might sound super, super naive. So I don't feel gaslighted. I've been ignored by more politicians from more political parties, and I've had hot dinners, and I still get up every morning and think I'm going to change the world. And that's because I'm both stupid and optimistic. Because what other way is there to go through the world, is what I think.
Yeah. I'm hearing, yeah. And I reckon that's Scottish blood inside you, mate, running through you as well. That stubbornness.
Oh, no, can I tell you what Scottish people really
There
think?
you go.
My friend Andrew's heard this joke a million times, so forgive me. I'm Scottish, and I know that we are all doomed and going to hell in a handcart, but you might as well make the journey as enjoyable as you possibly can, because the destination is always the same.
That's it, right? Thanks. Look, I'm going to open up the floor now. I've got Crystal would like to ask a question of you, please. Crystal, if you come off mute, that would be lovely.
Hello, I'm just wondering, when the recommendations are passed down to state and territory governments, is there any formal agreement that they actually have to act on any of the recommendations? And is there risk that each state and territory minister might pick and choose what they feel they can deliver on and what they want to ignore?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really important question. And I don't know, what do I think? This is my first national review ever. So I'm in uncharted territory for me. One of the things I hope, but I can't put it any more strongly than that, is that the governments of Australia will not cherry pick what recommendations we put to them. But that doesn't mean they've got to agree with all our recommendations, because they are the governments of Australia. I hope the governments of Australia together will feel committed to continuing to work together. The terms of reference of this review were agreed by all the governments of Australia. They were very wide, perhaps too wide, but that doesn't matter. They gave us these wide recommendations. But one of the things that I think, and forgive me for suggesting something to Physical Disability Australia, but it also applies, for instance, to Physical Disability New South Wales, who I used to work with, and other advocacy organisations in states and territories, and Advocacy for Inclusion here in Canberra, ADICAS also here in Canberra. You will know the ones that are in your local area. Because this review is a joint venture, and because we are going to say what other people have said for years, is that what happens in our local government, states governments, territory governments is as important as many other things. They should feel accountable to people with disability in their organisations in states and territories as much as anyone might feel accountable through this national process. As far as I know, no review has ever had all of its recommendations accepted. It'd be naive of me to imagine that we will be the first. But I hope there's no cherry picking. But and forgive me, because you ask a really good question, and it makes me think of lots of things that we need to remember. One of the problems of the NDIS has faced in its first 10 years is that it has been reviewed and scrutinised and written about more than almost any other organisation or system you could think of. And one of the things that people told us, and which we will say in our final report, and we've already said to people, is that government, from the Joint Standing Committee of the Australian Parliament to the local state parliaments and territory parliaments, they've conducted reviews. There are 1 million recommendations that have been made by reviews, government committees, independent panels and committees of parliaments that have just been ignored. There's a very good report from 2019 called the Tune Report. The government of the day, so that 2019, the government of the day accepted in principle all of the recommendations of the Tune review, but implemented almost none of them, except the one that they called independent assessments, which I was vociferously opposed to. And when they implemented that one report, one recommendation out of that report, they implemented in a way that the report didn't even recommend, because they didn't actually want to listen to the report in the first place. So I think you've asked a really, really important question. And we, through our organisations, need to remain active and vigilant to make sure cherry picking doesn't happen, and that recommendations from any review that have a consensus behind them must be implemented as quickly as possible, consistent with making sure that people with disability have a say in how they will be implemented. Sorry to be so long as usual.
That's great. That's a really good explanation. Thank you. I'm going to hand over. Melanie has a question for you. Dougie? So you come off mute, Mel?
Yes, sorry. I'm losing my voice a little and it's got a bit dark, but my question was, will the review address the exclusion of people over 65 with disabilities?
We'll certainly address it. And I mean, I have to go through life declaring interests. So I know I look like a young Brad Pitt. But I'm actually 66 years old. So this is deeply personal. I've been an NDIS participant for 5 years or whatever. I'm at that point where human service systems talk about transition. There is a transition point between disability and aged care. One of the areas that we will make suggestions to government about is how we, as a country, manage those points of transition. Because it's clear, whatever one thinks about it, the NDIS was set up to support people up to the age of 65, or you could enter the NDIS at up to the age of 65. If you were in the NDIS before you were 65, you could remain in the NDIS if that was your choice. And we know that the population of people who are 65 and over, who are NDIS participants, is growing. The governments in Australia need to work out how that tension, I put it no more strongly than that, will be managed as we go through the next 10, 20, and 30 years. And I believe that, because we're not looking at the aged care system, I believe personally that one of the things that we need to look at is the ways in which whatever so-called system you're in, the NDIS or the aged care system, your needs are met. Whatever your needs are at the point at which you have those needs. And I attended a meeting at the request of, I was invited to a meeting by a woman called Louise Yabsley, who many people with a spinal cord injury know, with Senator Pocock. And it was specifically about the question of aging with a disability or becoming a person with a disability over the age of 65. I was one of the youngest people in the room, which is interesting. But people who'd had motor traffic accidents and other injuries post 65, who said that life for them in the aged care sector was very challenging, and it was creating problems both for them as individuals, but also for their spouses and partners, who were themselves, of course, aging. The NDIS minister has said that the Commonwealth government has no intention to remove the current age categorizations around the NDIS. I personally wouldn't be advocating for that, because I don't think that's a realizable political goal, but that's just me. But we will try to put those points better described in the set of recommendations and analysis in the report that we submit to government about there must be solutions found to what people describe as inequities between the two systems.
Cool. Thank you, Dougie. I've got one last question for you. I'm just going to find it. I've got to scroll back up through the chat. Sorry. Gosh, where's it gone? It hasn't disappeared. Come on, where is it? Oh, here we go. All right. This is from Mark in New South Wales. He says, he asked the question, with all the state-based buck passing regarding state-based services and gaps in safeguarding, has legislation change been considered to introduce an independent arbiter to oversee responsibilities at the interface between justice, health, mental health, and education to enforce that the COAG agreements are actually followed? That's a lot of big words.
No, I've not seen such a suggestion. And I'm going to do two things. One is suggest to you that if you have any good idea from your point of view about how we can reform the NDIS and other systems, please put it into the Have Your Say page of the ndisreview.gov.au website. When I say submission, it doesn't have to be War and Peace. It can just be a sentence, a few bullet points. You can phone up the Secretariat that's in the Prime Minister and Cabinet's office, the number's on the website, and tell them what you think. You could do a brief video and submit it. Any way you think you've got something that would help the discussion, and you've got 2 weeks to submit it, I think. Please do. And so I've not seen that suggestion. I don't know if it's a good suggestion or not, to be perfectly frank, because we call it interface, don't we? I mean,
yeah.
I just think, Doesn't matter who you are, person with disability, no person with disability. If you need a hospital, you should be able to go to the hospital. If you need a doctor, you should be able to go to the doctor. And I know that sounds super naive. I think it's that simple. And for some reason, we've made it much more complicated. And I think the reason we've made it much more complicated is because we've got discrimination and disadvantage against people with disability. And that's thousands of years old. And that doesn't get fixed. But we've got a United Nations Convention, which gives us those rights. But the really fascinating word, which I think we want to try and make sure doesn't happen, because it used to happen in the past, and I think it still goes on, was that notion of buck passing that you use, Mark. I think we all want, I want certainly, presumptuous of me to say what we want. I think what we need is to encourage the governments of Australia to give up the idea that buck passing, cost shifting, and dollar dancing is the right way to go about organising supports that people need. And I think the governments of Australia, when they do good work well together. But when they do their worst work, which sometimes they do, it's because they go, oh, that's not a health responsibility, that work. So we're sending your letter to the Minister for Disability. Or I'm sorry, we can't deal with that because we don't deal with Aboriginal people. There's an Aboriginal department. And those kinds of crude, siloed, knee-jerk responses don't help us solve problems. And again, I realize this sounds super naive, but I think we need our governments to work together to kind of leave the governmental egos at the door, to say, okay, there's a problem, let's nut it out, state, Commonwealth, local. Let's build relationships in the community that work for the community we serve, and then fix problems. Because I think that's what in a democracy government is for. But I do recognise Mark's much more and correct, practical focused.
I'll jump in quick. The government themselves have actually been they've sort of taken ownership. The issue is more at the coal face where people don't understand legislation. There's no one actually to guide the discussion and help people that are stuck in the gaps. And often it's the most disadvantaged or people with disabilities that are left without, while governments essentially are discussing over who's government departments are discussing who's footing the bill.
Good point, Mark. And to be more specific to your answer in relation to the review and what it might do, is one of the ideas, and again, this is not an original idea for me or anybody else, it was discussed. If any of you attended, you may have done or may not, Disability Services Consulting ran an online conference a few months ago. Minister Shorten spoke at that, as did lots of other people, about good ideas for reform of the NDIS. And one of the words that became a sort of buzzword during the conference was the idea of a navigator inside the NDIS. I believe that navigator, if we had one, and we think of ourselves in our organisation as sort of navigators because we provide support coordination, which we think we do very well, but it's just us. But the idea of a navigator would be an agent, if you like, of the participant and people in the mainstream, maybe through foundational supports, who is there to assist in participants to, forgive the wanky language, mobilize their plan. Because it's very confusing to be suddenly presented with your NDIS plan with its core capacity building, stated support terminologies. It might have $50,000 in it, it might have $400,000 in it. And people go, well, when people come to us in my organization, they say, what does this mean? How can I spend it? Where do I go? And because it's a natural relationship in a sense to be given an individualized budget, a plan letter, and be told, go off and live your life exercising choice and control. And the idea of having a funded navigator who is there to support people to get the best out of their plans, to help them negotiate between health and disability or housing. That is an idea that I think people have told us would be welcome if it's organised and funded in the right way. And so that might be something that sits alongside suggestions like an arbiter between government departments, beyond the kind of, the official things like ombudsman offices. But
Cool.
if any of you have got a good idea, stick it in the Have Your Say page at the website. The team in the Secretariat in the Prime Minister and Cabinet Office will read it, use it, and build it into all the other advice, commentary, submissions we've got from people around the country to hopefully make this the best review report we can.
Thank you, Dougie. I'm just being mindful of the time here. Look, your information and your knowledge has been incredible. Thank you for sharing with us this afternoon. It's been very, very informative. I think a lot of people have got a lot of information out of this. If anybody else has any questions that they want to send through to Dougie, please feel free to send them to promotion@pda.org.au, and then Natasha will be able to pass them on to Dougie or through to the independent review panel. As Dougie has mentioned as well, written submissions have been extended up until Friday, the 1st of September. And that's because the review panel has just been inundated with a whole bunch of requests to do that. So they have done that. And as Dougie has said a couple of times during his presentation, www.ndisreview.gov.au/have your say, and you can put anything in there. Natasha's going to email you all that link tomorrow when she gets back into her office. So look, Dougie, on behalf of everybody who's here, on behalf of the staff and the board at PDA, I really appreciate your time this afternoon, your knowledge, your wisdom in this, and also your support of folks with disabilities all over Australia, because it means a lot to all of us that we've actually managed to get a say in what's happening with this review. And we look forward to the results of that when in due course, when they come out. So thank you very much for your time, everybody, tonight. And I look forward to seeing you at our next one when we come around to it.
Thank you very much indeed, everybody. It's a great privilege to be here. I mean that deeply.
Thanks, mate. Appreciate it.